the way I like to explain the policymaking process is that it's not linear. It's not something where you start here and you end here and then it's over. Lawmaking is more of a cycle, and it's something that, you never get everything right the first time, and things change over time, right? So you're constantly going back through this cycle and trying to improve. So the cycle starts for me with issue identification. That means figuring out what is the problem. This is something where you can say, hey, this is something that's affecting me every day, or hey, this is something that my loved one is facing in prison, or this is something that I see happening outside in my neighborhood all the time, and that makes me less safe. And identifying the issue, what really is the problem there, is an important first place to start. Because once you can say, here's what the problem is, then you can start doing research, and you can look to find out, how many people are experiencing that here. Is it a problem that affects certain types of people differently than it affects others? Is this a problem that happens in other places too? And we can learn from other cities or other states about how they've dealt with the problem. Is this something that has been the focus of research over time? Do we know, do we know through research what some good solutions to this problem are? So after you identify the problem, you move into research and you gather as much information as you can. And then once you have that information, once you know everything there is to know, or everything that is possible to know in the period of time that you have, that's when you really get to policy development. And policy development is saying, okay, here's the problem. Here's what I know about it. This is how I think the problem should be solved. And when you're developing policy, you get to test things. So you can say, here's, how I think it would be solved. Let me think, what if this happened? What if this happened? What would be any unintended consequences? You can think through what the implications would be for implementing a policy solution like that. Another really good thing to do at this point is to go talk to other people, because, your perspective on the issue is never going to be the only perspective on the issue, right? If this is something that affects your neighborhood, go talk to your other neighbors. Go talk to people who work in the neighborhood. Go talk to people in government who would be whose job it would be to go implement this policy. If it were adopted. This is a really good time to get feedback from anyone who might be impacted by the policy solution, and to really try to perfect what you think the answer to this problem is. So once you get from issue identification to research to policy development, that is where you create a bill. And this is where the law change happens. So you make a bill that would change the law in a way to implement the policy that you have developed as part of your solution. And you will spend a bunch of time here advocating to get that bill adopted. Advocating to the council to, pass it through committee, to pass it through the full council, advocating to the mayor and to the council to fund that solution once a bill is passed, making sure that this solution can get through Congress once it's enacted. And this is something that happens on a 2-year cycle within DC's legislative council periods. Once you have a bill passed, it can be really tempting to say, good, we're done. But unfortunately, it takes more work than that to make sure that the policy solution that you developed is really going to fix the issue that you identified. So after you have that law change enacted, after you have it funded, you have to look at implementation, and you have to see, is the government actually doing what this bill asks them to do? How is it going? What's working? What's not working? What are the surprises that we're encountering along the way? And as you go through implementation, it's really important to evaluate whether you're getting the intended outcome from your bill, right? Go back to that initial problem. What was the issue you identified? What was the problem? And is this problem really being fixed? Are there any other consequences of the change in law that need to be addressed? And then you can come right back up to the top to issue identification again, right? So, for instance, about a decade ago, DC passed criminal record sealing and expungement laws for the first time ever. And they were very limited to, a set of misdemeanors and one felony conviction. So we identified, advocates in DC, people with criminal records in DC, identified that the criminal record sealing law in DC wasn't good enough. People had to wait forever. A lot of people were ineligible because of the types of convictions they had. It was really hard to do. And so the issue that they identified was that our criminal record sealing and expungement process wasn't working. And at the research stage, a bunch of different experts went out and sought information on, what other states do when it comes to criminal record sealing and expungement, what works, what doesn't work, looking at the research, how long, based on the research, how long does it take for someone to go from being arrested to probably never being arrested again? What does the waiting period look like? What kind of evidence do we have to support that? And then the policy was developed. For instance, here at DC Justice Lab, we developed something called the Restore Act that was our proposal for solving that problem. And the Restore Act was one proposal, but a bunch of other people had their proposals too. There were 5 different bills at council from the mayor and several other council members. And when the council considered those bills, they took some of one thing, some of another thing, and put together the package that they thought was best. And we are now at a point where the implementation is starting, but we are not quite there yet. We don't have the funding for the bill. We don't have an evaluation procedure in place to decide, whether this is working or not. And so we are going to keep advocating for implementation of that bill. And once it is implemented, we're going to check and see how it's working. Because even if it's working perfectly, next year, 10 years from now, we might have different circumstances. And it might not need to be updated again. And so we'll start that cycle of lawmaking all over.